I'd like to thank you all for being here. My name is Joni Funderburk, and I am a Colorado educator. I've been a math teacher for over 25 years, and I'm really excited to be here with you today to share some information about how better standards and better tests are going to create better prepared students in Colorado. I really would like to say thanks to all of the folks from Climb Higher Colorado who organized this opportunity for all of us. And I'm going to just go ahead and get us kicked off. I know we'll have some other folks joining us as they can. Because I've been a teacher for 25 years, I can't stand up in front of a room of people without letting you know what the learning goals are and why I'm here and what it is I want you to gain from being here today. So in teacher fashion, I'm hoping at the end of this session that you will have an understanding of what the term assessments mean from an educator perspective. We're hearing a lot of that term thrown around, and it means different things to people who live in the world of education and those who aren't as familiar or entrenched there. We also would like you to have a good understanding of the PARCC assessment for math and English language arts and how Colorado has played a role in the development of those assessments. And then finally, we're going to have you experience some PARCC-like assessment items. So instead of me telling you how those assessment items are different than how they used to be, I'm going to allow you to experience that yourselves. So we're going to start with a couple of guest speakers. We'll learn some information about assessments in general. We'll learn some specifics about the PARCC assessment. And then I'm going to get to share with you my experiences, both as an educator in the state and my work with PARCC. And then we'll get into some of those assessment items. At the end of the session, there'll be time for questions and answers. So please take note of what those are as we progress through and know that you'll have time to ask those when we get to the end. Okay, so I'd like to first introduce Jill Hawley. Jill is here from the Colorado Department of Education all the way across the street, and her title is Associate Commissioner of Achievement and Strategy. So,
great. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking some time at the lunch hour to come and talk about this important topic around assessment. It's also a popular topic. It's often not the topic people want to talk about at lunch, is test taking. But assessment plays such a critical role in instruction. It is part and parcel of what good instruction is and is all about. And it happens in so many different ways in our classrooms. And so I just want to share a little bit about what a full and comprehensive assessment system looks like and what ways the Department of Education and the state plays a role in that assessment system. So just like when you go to the doctor and you have a blood test, they're going to give you a sense of what your cholesterol level is. It's kind of it's a test that's given throughout all hospitals. Anywhere you go, it's going to be the same kind of test. It's going to give you a sense of whether your cholesterol is high or not compared to other people. It's not going to tell the doctor what to do about it. It's not going to necessarily tell you what to do about it until the doctor can go in and do some diagnostic tests and go deeper to understand what's happening. So in the medical field, there are a series and range of kinds of tests that are used to help inform health. In the same way, in education, we have a series of kinds of tests that are used to inform student learning and progress over time. And we really call that having a balanced assessment system that's comprised of formative assessments, which are classroom-based assessments that teachers are giving all the time. So a quick example of that would be fist to 5. How many of you are enjoying your lunch? So that is a quick, formative, in-the-moment test for a teacher to see how quickly kids are getting a concept. Or they ask, before you leave the door, you have to give me an exit ticket that says the 3 things that you accomplished today or learned today. Those are happening all the time in the classroom. Then, as you move along the scale, you're going to get to interim assessments, which are more progress monitoring, those little dipsticks to see how are our kids performing? Are they gaining the growth that we need to along the way to get them ready to learn and master those our standards by the end of grade level. Then you have your summative tests, which are either those end of course tests, end of chapter tests, or the state summative tests that are checking in to see have kids mastered the content. And the reason I'm sharing some of this information is because assessments happening all the time, and those assessments are all meant to answer different kinds of questions. And some of the confusion that we often hear in the assessment world and that we're hearing today about over-testing and too many tests, forget to acknowledge that there are a range of tests that are taking place. They're designed to answer different questions, and we may want to have a conversation of, have we balanced it right? Is it weighted too heavily to state tests and not enough to classroom tests? Those are all good conversations to have, but it's important to know that all of those kinds of assessments are valuable and play a role in our system. And I'm going to hand out, and folks can just take one and pass them along, something that just kind of explains those different types of assessments. Today, we are going to be we're going to have some time to hear about the state summative test and the changes that are taking place in Colorado. And just for those of you who may not be as familiar with the new assessment, how many of you are aware of CSAP or TCAP, right? Okay, so those tests have been in place. Really, Colorado is one of the states with the longest and oldest state assessment system. So the CSAP was put in place to monitor and gauge progress on the Colorado Model Content Standards, which have been replaced with the new Colorado Academic Standards. So when we went to new standards, we adopted a transitional test that would allow us to transition to fully assessing on those new standards. We finished the last year of that TCAP this year, and we'll be moving to the new test of our standards in English Language Arts and Math. And that is developed through PARCC, and we're going to have a chance to hear about those tests. At the same time, Colorado has been developing its own social studies and science assessments. Those went live this year. We're in the second week of administering online assessments. Amazingly, the world is still going on. But we have learned a lot. By the end of next week, about 240,000 kids in Colorado will have experienced online tests. It's really exciting. Hasn't been without some glitches. We're learning. This is new. We expected it. We've also field tested. About 13,000 kids have field tested the English Language Arts and Math. Those will go live next year. We're learning a lot, but the great news for us is that kids are engaged in these assessments. They're finding them to be much more familiar to the way that they interact with the world. We get comments like, please don't make us do another bubble test. We love testing on the computers. So what we're going to get to hear about today is the piece of our new assessment system, the summative component, that is being developed with Colorado, a major player, with other states across the country through PARCC. And Laura Slover's here from PARCC to share with you more about that test, answer questions, and for us to engage in some of the items which I think are really helpful and fun. And I will say one of the exciting pieces about how assessment is changing is that we often have asked of our TCAP or those end of year tests that the state does to answer lots of questions that they were never quite designed to do well. They were never designed to be in the moment classroom tests. The great thing about PARCC and where we're able to go with online assessments is that it is going to be able to answer more questions, get more timely results back into the classroom, and meet those needs. And PARCC is also looking at filling some of the other areas in this chart in terms of having some diagnostic assessments, teacher tools and training, and a whole bunch of resources that will really be a support to the field. So I'll turn it over now to Laura to share a little bit more about the PARCC English Language Arts and Math tests.
Thank you. And thank you. And thanks to all of those who put together this panel. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm Laura Slover, and I'm the CEO of PARCC, but my career started here in Colorado. I was a high school English teacher at Battle Mountain High School in Eagle County for 4 years. And actually in the early days, and this was, I'm not sure exactly when the CSAP was started, but I was part of administering the CSAP to my students and was part of an early effort in the district to build an assessment system that included some pre-testing and post-testing so we could look at student growth. This was 1996, 97, 98. I will not. I will admit that we were not as far along in our thinking as we are now today, but it was an early attempt to do that, and an acknowledgement that what's really important is to grow students and to help them proceed along a path, not just look at status along the way. So that's my background. I've had the great pleasure of participating in work with a number of states over the last 15 years. In my previous role at Achieve, helping states build high-quality standards, building assessments to match those standards, and helping them implement with fidelity good standards. And in the last 4 years, I've focused my work on PARCC, working with states to build assessments to help implement the standards. So Colorado's at the forefront of that group. I'm going to spend my time, I think, talking about a few things. Who is PARCC? What is PARCC about? Just kind of take a step back and make sure everybody knows what that means when we say PARCC. What the PARCC tests look like and why they're different from state tests currently. And where we are in our process and where we're going to go. And then I'm going to turn it over to an educator who is going to walk you through a bunch of math items and really kind of show you what it looks like, which I'm really excited about. And then we can do questions. So who is PARCC? I guess I should advance the slide. So this shows you who your PARCC states are. So PARCC is actually not me. I serve in the role that supports states, and my job is to help the states build the assessment program and the assessment system that is going to help them move forward on their agenda of helping prepare all students for college and careers. So the board of directors of PARCC is made up of the chief state school officers from each of those states, and those states are, and for people who are watching this and can't see the screen, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, Louisiana, Illinois, Ohio, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Rhode Island, Maryland, Washington, D.C., Arkansas, Mississippi, New York, and Tennessee. Those states have been at the forefront of all of the development that's gone on for the last 4 years and really are pursuing this with great gusto. So who does that mean? That there are a lot of people involved, and this is on the left-hand side of your screen, you'll just see a big list of names. There are 4 pages of names of Colorado folks who have been involved in this process. There are about 70, and you have the handout, about 70 folks who regularly have a role and meet regularly. Over 12,000 meetings, believe it or not, have occurred in the last 4 years that have had Colorado representation at them. There are hundreds of other people who have had a little bit of touch and fingerprints on the development, and you can see the list of the kinds of people. There's higher ed folks, there are educators, there are folks from your SEA, and Joyce Zerkowski, just want to give a shout out to her, she's not here, but she's the Colorado Assessment Director, has spent countless hours helping shape an assessment program that will meet Colorado's needs. There are operational working groups, state item review committees, performance level descriptor panels, and Joni served on that panel, and she'll tell you a little bit about that. There's a technical group, a TAC, a Technical Advisory Committee. And so the big picture is that there's a lot of work going on, all of it driven by states, to the end of developing an incredible assessment. And since 2010, when the states came together, 10,000 items have been developed. Every one of those has had 30 sets of eyes on it, educators from across the states. So that's pretty exciting. And I think the shorthand of PARCC makes you think about people who sit in cubicles in a nameless, faceless office. And we do have some people in our offices, and they do sit in cubicles, but most of the people are out there in the field doing this work. This slide, which you can't see, shows all of the kinds of educator review. And at the risk of being weedy, I think it's really important to know that every item goes through multiple reviews so that people are looking at quality, people are looking at not just the quality of the items and how they align to the standards, but also looking at the passages in ELA literacy. I'm a former English teacher, so one of the really important things about this test is that all of the texts and the passages used on these tests are authentic. That means that they're not written by the testing company just for the use on this test. They're real things written by real people that have either appeared in magazines, in newspapers, real books. They're authentic texts, and that matters if you think about the kind of shifts we're making in the standards to teach complexity, really good analysis skills, and to make sure kids are ready when they go off into the world and go to college to read complex texts. Well, these are the kinds of texts that really are going to get them there. So these are all of the review panel. And I can go on and on about that, but I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to shift a little bit to the next set of issues that I want to talk about, which is the what. What is PARCC? What does the test look like? And I want to start by talking about the priorities. So when states came together in 2010, they set a number of priorities. There were some absolute priorities. For example, must measure and provide information back that it's going to be helpful to inform instruction. Measure the standards, inform instruction. And so taking from that set of priorities, that says a lot about the kind of level of information and data that will need to come out of this assessment. We're going to have to measure the full range of the standards, not just a little bit of the standards, but the full set of the Colorado academic standards to make sure that we have a sense of how kids are doing across those standards. We also are going to provide a number of other tools, which I'm going to get to on another slide, that provide information that's really useful to teachers. This isn't separate from the work teachers do. It's meant to be really part of the work that teachers do and to support them. The assessments are going to be built to be 21st century tools. That means they're being built to be delivered on a computer. And they're going to provide that opportunity to have more engaging, technology-enhanced items. They'll allow results to come back much more quickly because the computer-generated scoring mechanisms that we have can generate results much faster with the goal of getting results back into the hands of teachers before the end of the school year. That's a significant shift from what happens in many states. The technology also allows accommodations to be built in, accommodations for kids who need larger print, who need read-aloud capabilities, a whole slew of accommodations that computer technology allows at the front end rather than having to sort of retrofit that at the back end. And that's a huge bonus. We know, however, that not all schools are going to be ready to deliver on technology, and therefore there are also pencil and paper tests available, and I want to just assure people that we are looking at a transition, but a realistic timeline for that transition. The other piece of the goal, so one goal is around instruction and really informing classroom practice. The other goal is around the requirement that the tests be designed specifically to measure growth, because growth really matters. I talked about my work looking at growth almost 20 years ago. Well, these tests are going to be designed to actually be indicators and valid measures of growth. Typically, we're seeing state assessments all over the country that are sort of being used for multiple purposes, but not purposes for which they were initially designed, and we're seeing pushback on that. These tests are actually designed to take those purposes into account, and so I think you'll see that they're more valid and more reliable for the uses that they'll be put to. Big picture, one of the other goals of this project is to provide useful information to students, parents, and teachers along that pathway from K to college, from K into the workforce. So these are going to provide data and feedback every year to students about their steps along that trajectory, with the ultimate goal of having kids enter directly into post-secondary credit-bearing courses that give them a credit and will ultimately lead to a degree or to a certificate that will help them get directly into a good job. So these are assessments that really have that ultimate goal in mind and will offer a ticket to a student to their next step in life. So there's a utility factor here that is not true of many current state tests. And so I think that's an important thing to highlight. So what's different? If we take a step back and look at what's different about PARCC, I think there's a number of factors, some of which I've talked about, that are really quite different and pretty useful. One is this emphasis on problem solving and critical thinking skills. These are not going to be simply a set of fill in the bubble tests. I think that Colorado's already well past that, but it's worth saying that these are really going to be include performance-based tasks, which I'll talk about in a moment, that ask students to generate original responses, write, think, solve problems that will take a little bit of extended time to do. These are not just quick in and out tests. They require kids to think and produce, and that's a shift. Even in Colorado, which is already doing constructed response, this is the next generation of what constructed response looks like. They'll provide information in a timely way to teachers about students' strengths and weaknesses, so they can better target student needs. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the non-summative tools that we're developing. They will help determine whether students are on track for college and career well in advance of that end of high school point, so that teachers can help and parents can help put students on that path if they're not quite there. That's a really important aspect of this program. Writing, there's writing at every grade, and not just one writing assessment. There's several opportunities for students to write in which they have to read and write about what they've read. I'll talk more about that. And then one important thing that's different is that students' results will be compared across districts, across schools, across states. So perhaps for the first time, you'll know how students in Colorado are doing compared to students in New Mexico, compared to students in Massachusetts and Ohio. We do have NAEP results, but those are at the state level. They're not student level results. They can't be used when students cross state lines and pick up and move and go to another school in a PARCC state. These results will be transportable and will follow the student. So that's a really important aspect to help students have continuity even if they switch schools within and across states. I want to shift now to the assessment system and the different components of it. And then we'll do a deep dive on the summative assessments, and then I'll turn it over. So, as Jill said, we are developing more than a summative assessment. We see PARCC as a system of assessments that create a package that have many of the elements that Jill talked about. I don't know how well you can see this particular slide, so I'm going to read it to you, not slowly, but first of all, the kinds of assessment that Jill talked about, diagnostic assessments that can give teachers in the moment information about how their students are doing, so they can shift course if they need to, so they can catch kids up, so it doesn't get to be the end of the year before they are really focusing on what strengths and weaknesses kids have. Districts are already doing this. This isn't necessarily a new thing, but it's part of a comprehensive aligned system so that as you think about the assessments that you're giving in your districts, in your schools, you can think about making sure that that package is all connected and not a set of disparate tools that don't really line up and speak to one another and build on one another. So diagnostic assessments, mid-year and interim assessments, and Jill talked about that, looking at a moment in time and seeing how kids are doing is important. And the interim assessments that PARCC is developing are more of these performance-based tasks where as a high school teacher, particularly in my upper classroom, I gave a writing assessment every week. It was basically either an old AP question or something based on their reading. So they would have had to have read what they were doing in class. Sometimes I gave them a piece to read, and then they would have to do a writing assessment in the 45-minute class period, and I'd collect it. And then the next class period, we would talk about their writing. And that's sort of the way these are designed, to be really focused on a performance, so in ELA, a writing experience, and then to provide rubrics and example student work to help classrooms get better at that practice. So these are not complete yet, but that's the vision for them moving forward. There will be a speaking and listening assessment, which really helps kids think about, when you talk to college professors, one of the things they always say is that their kids don't come in prepared to present and to engage in meaningful discussion. So PARCC is going to develop some tools for speaking and listening that will be helpful to teachers in eliciting that kind of engagement from kids. So then there's the end of the year assessment. There are two components of the end of year assessment, the summative assessment. And one is this performance-based piece, which will be given a little bit earlier than the end of the year because it's going to require students to produce, to write, to do multi-step problems in math. And therefore, it's going to take a little longer to score and will require human scoring. We want to be at the place where the automated scoring will help accelerate that, but in the short term, while we're studying that capability, we want to make sure that there's time for real humans to get in and score. So that component will be at about 75% or 80% of the way through the academic year. And then the results from that piece, which will be this the score on a student piece of writing will then be connected to, aggregated with the score on the end of year component. The end of year component is going to be a quickly scored piece that emphasizes in ELA literacy. It's going to emphasize really the reading, finding the main idea in the text, showing comprehension of text, and in math, really demonstrating understanding of the key concepts in each grade level. And if you've looked closely at the math standards, you know that unlike standards in the past, there are key areas of focus. So there's not necessarily equal emphasis placed on everything from year to year, the way that there was when I was a teacher, certainly, and there were common reporting categories. Every year there's geometry, algebra, number, data. Well, now you'll see something different where there's key areas of emphasis on the key building block topics. So that's what the end of year component will really focus on. Those scores combined will be the students' total score. As I said, those results will come back quite quickly. I want to make one caveat about that, which is that in the first year, the data won't come back quickly. Why? Because that first summer after the administration, so summer of 15, there'll be work across the states to do what's called standard setting. So taking the performance level descriptors that have been worked on over the last couple years and basically finding those places where the cut points are between level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, level 5, that will then become the reporting performance levels. So the results in the first year will come back in the early fall. We know that's frustrating, but we will then therefore be able to get scores out much more quickly after that. Let's see, I want to think if there's anything else I want to say about those assessments. One of the things we're hearing about the assessments as we go out and do work in classrooms, I got the opportunity to be in a 6th grade classroom last month, or earlier this month, was how excited kids are about the items. I sat in a 6th grade classroom taking an English language arts test on the computer, and the test allows them to do things that they've never really done before on a test. Highlight evidence for their answer. So it asks them to show you what the main idea of the text is or what the author's main central point is. And then the next question is, show me the evidence. Why do you think that? Go back and find the place in the text that that is your justification for that. So it's very text-based. There are no questions that are text-dependent, meaning you can just go look at the item and get it right if you haven't read the text. They all really require students to go back in the text. And then after having read several passages, kids were then asked to write an essay about what they'd read, bringing evidence from multiple sources. And it was just quite exciting to see them do it and then to talk about after their experiences doing it, how fun it was. Fun, they used the word fun associated with summative assessment. They were really excited about taking it out on the computer. They really liked the questions and said, hey, I like it because this is what we're doing in class. And I thought, yeah, but for them, that had not been their experience. They had thought of assessment quite differently, as disconnected from it, as an event that was separate from it, and this felt much more embedded to them. They also had lots of things to tell us about how we could do things better, how we could make this button bigger because they missed it, how we could make the scrolling function a little more nimble. I mean, we had great feedback from them. Every kid on this who's taking the field test is filling out a survey, giving us feedback. Every test administrator is filling out a survey, giving us feedback about what worked when they logged on. We heard a lot about how the directions, particularly in one area, were very complicated and how we could streamline them. So we're learning a lot from the work that we're doing, which will then go into the next round of development. We have now completed half of the field test. We've tested about 500,000 kids, 13,000 of those here in Colorado. By the end of the field test, we will have tested over 1 million students. So the data about these items will be really rich across the 15 states. And then we take that information and move forward to build the forms for the final test that will come out next year. Yeah, hi.
Thank you for letting me interrupt.
No problem.
Otherwise, I'll forget my question.
Yeah, I do that too.
You probably almost answered my question with the number of students you tested, but my question was, has this been tested on kids that have varying levels of competency with computer skills?
Yes. So a field test is, by definition, a big research study. And so the field test isn't a test of students. There are no individual student results that come back, but it's designed to test kids it's a very scientific design built by psychometric experts to test kids across many different things. So they're tests of kids at all different ability levels, different demographics. We're testing online and on pencil and paper, and the online tests are on a variety of devices. I want to introduce Susan Van Gundy, who's here, who's our technology director, and so she's been in the weeds with all of this field testing to make sure that it can be tested on Chromebooks, on iPads, on laptops, on desktops. And then one of the questions is, do kids perform differently? Is there a difference in performance across those devices? There's been those studies before, not as many as you'd think, but this will be the first very large-scale study of this between the PARCC kids across all of the 15 states and the states that are, like Colorado, going out with science and social studies doing things online as well. So we'll be able to answer that question, which is a really important question to have. One of the things that we pay a lot of attention to in the assessment world is comparability. And in order to make claims about comparability, you have to have very similar administration rules. So understanding what the administration rules about computers is going to be really important. Does everybody have to take it on the same device? Or are we moving into a world where kids should take it on the device that they're most comfortable with? We're in a shift in the technology and assessment world where the answer in the past has been same device. And now I think the data is going to look different, but that's what we are going to study and see. We ultimately want to be in a position where kids are taking things in the way that they're most comfortable, because that's going to give them the best advantage and be most similar to what they're doing in the classroom. I wanted to think if there's anything else I want to say about the field test. We are going to share not individual student or school level data, but lessons learned from the field test. That's been definitely something that people have asked for on an aggregate level. What did you learn? What did kids have an easy time with? What was hard for them? What worked on the computer? What didn't? Some of the questions about device differences and if we found those. How did the accommodations work? How did the manuals work? Were they effective or were they just confusing? We're studying all of those things, so we'll probably share lessons learned on those things at the end of the summer. Just a note about the other things we're doing. I mentioned them. Those are now under development, and we're about 6 months behind where we are in the summative assessment for these tools, which are perhaps the most exciting things to teachers, and for me as a former teacher, the things that I really want to get into classrooms. That is both too bad that they're not further along and a really cool opportunity for folks from districts to get their educators involved in developing these tools so that they reflect the best of classroom practice. So it's an open invitation to Colorado educators to get involved in the development of diagnostic assessments. This is a set of resources that are on our website. PARCC is perhaps the most transparent effort ever in terms of student assessment. We're required to be simply because of the way the consortium is set up. But it turns out that that's a really good thing because everything we've ever created is on the website. It's all pretty weedy and good, not necessarily good bedtime reading, but it's there. And so it's a really good set of resources for teachers. There's model content frameworks, there's test specifications, blueprints, sample items. We released about a month ago practice tests, which can be used, I think, with the public to just get people into the testing. Ask people, and I told this story this morning, people in New Orleans, the newspaper in New Orleans has published an item a week to get legislators and the public and just general readers involved in what student assessment looks like and how these items are going to be different and more exciting. And I think they have a little contest to see who can get the items right quickest. Anything to create a public conversation about student assessment and take the mystery out of it, I think, can be helpful. So these are a number of tools that can be helpful to you. Looking ahead, next year is the first year of formal PARCC administration. There are it's going to be very exciting first year. There's a lot going on, and you have a number of partners in this work. If you go back to the list of states that I shared with you at the beginning. And one of the most exciting things about this effort for me is the cross-state conversation, partly at the policy level, so with Commissioner Hammond and his colleagues, but more importantly probably at the educator level. And I think it's a really good segue because the work that we're seeing amongst educators within and across states to really dig into the standards and into the assessments is really, on many levels, what makes this most exciting, most innovative, and most new and different. So, good segue. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so I hope you guys have a little more solid background. I want to talk to you a little bit about my personal experience as an educator with PARCC and echo some of the comments that Laura just made. As a classroom teacher, I've actually been part of PARCC on 3 different levels specifically, and adding a 4th here in the next few weeks. The first thing that I got to do was help write the performance level descriptors. Now, again, this is one of the things that is completely new. There's not something for me to tell you that's like, oh, it's like this with CSAT, because nothing like performance level descriptors has existed before. These are described as a document, and I'm going to read this just off the PARCC website, that describe the knowledge, skills, and practices students performing at a given performance level are able to demonstrate at any grade level. So what that means is when we think about the TCAP test, as an educator, I would get TCAP data back about my students, and it would say, well, this student is partially proficient high, and this student is advanced low. And as a parent, I would get my kids' TCAP scores in the mail, and it would say, your student is proficient, and their scale score was 576, and here's a little band that shows you what the range is for proficient and how far away from advanced they were, right? And that's the extent of the information that we got. As a teacher, I could then go digging further into some information. I'd go out on CDE's website and look up the standards frameworks, and I'd put together some different reports from the data that we get to try to figure out what is it that my kids know. Partially proficient high, what does that mean? Well, you're not where you're supposed to be, but what is the math you're lacking? How can I help you get to where you need to be? That information has not been available to us before. The performance level descriptors now will provide that information very specifically for us. We wrote multi-page documents, and these are available on PARCC online. I can't echo enough Laura's comment about transparency. There's so much information on that website about what this test is going to look like, what the expectations are for students. When you read the performance level descriptors, you'll see them in columns based on performance levels. So instead of getting descriptors like proficient or partially proficient or advanced, we're going to get a numerical score. And the target score on the PARCC test will be a 4 on a scale from 1 to 5. So a student that has strong command of the content they're supposed to know to be on track for college or career readiness will score at a 4. When they're at a 4, we'll be able to say exactly what content they know and are able to do. If they're at a 3, we'll know exactly what content they know and are able to do, and we'll be able to compare that to a 4 and know specifically what we need to do to get them where they're intended to be. What's exactly missing? What does a student need to do to differentiate a 4 from a 3? So from a teacher perspective, the performance level descriptors partnered with the assessment results are going to be invaluable information for me to be actionable with my students and be sure, particularly the ones who are not on track, that I can get them caught up. The other way it's really nice is it helps me see how I can push advanced students even further. If a student is already meeting the level 4 benchmark, how do I get them further without creating gaps in their learning? We don't want to just say, well, just go to the next math class, you're clearly ready. We want to be able to get them deeper into the content of their grade level so they're building a more solid foundation and are able to be more successful as they progress through. Performance level descriptors will also be huge information for parents, for students, for counselors at schools, for interventions. All sorts of stakeholders are going to want to be able to read these documents, and they're going to give us much more meaningful information about our students than we've had before. To be a part of the writing process was one of the best professional experiences I've had in my 25 years as an educator. We sat around a table and we had representatives, we had state level content experts, we had university folks, we had classroom teachers, we had district support personnel, we even had item writers sitting at the table with us as we were writing the performance level descriptors. And as we're talking about what's the target level of math for a student, we could they could hear those conversations. So when we were saying, well, it's this, but not this, and we want to be sure that they don't get bogged down in this skill, that we can really assess this understanding. And the item writers were sitting at the table with us and talking about how they might design an item that could reflect what we were designing in the performance level descriptors. So I was really excited to be a part of that process and can tell you that the educator voice was definitely heard. I also sat on committees for a couple of the item reviews, and I don't need to elaborate too much on that because Laura told you it goes through multiple different lenses, multiple different committees that view that. There's a whole bias and sensitivity committee that looks at items for bias and sensitivity. Obviously, I served on the committee that looked at content. Does this align to the content? Is this an appropriate question? And one of the things that my group just sort of individually said is we want to be sure the items that we're recommending are problems worth doing. That this is something that will be interesting to kids and will actually further their understanding of the mathematics by completing this problem. Not just a rote sort of, can you spit out and regurgitate what somebody might have said to you 3 weeks ago. So that was a pretty exciting process. And the other thing I was really impressed with the item review is that we could recommend changes. If we thought an item just didn't quite make it, we could say, well, if you change this, and the item writers sometimes by the very next day would have changed the item for our approval. So really the educator voice being heard, not just letting us sit around the table and give our feedback, but actually watching PARCC take action on our feedback was extremely empowering. Jody, I don't want to interrupt. We're only about 10 minutes left. Okay, we'll rush through then. And then finally, I also serve on the Colorado Educator Leader Cadre. So PARCC brings leaders from across all of the PARCC states together about every 6 months, and we have the opportunity to learn about the latest information. They give us professional development information that we can then take back to our states. All of the information about the model content frameworks and the performance level descriptors and all of those resources that Laura mentioned, we're actually trained in those in the educator leader cadre so that we can bring those back to our state. So that's a great opportunity as well. So with the time that I have left, I want to not tell you about how it's different, but actually show you. So we're going to do some math. Don't get too nervous. I did pick 4th grade content. Even though my experience is teaching high school, I thought, how about a nice logarithms problem? And then maybe we'll go with rounding and place values. So if you're not able to get a copy of the handout, it's up here on the slide as well. I want to demonstrate sort of what it used to look like. Prior to the Common Core state standards, in math we paid a lot of attention to the right answer. The right answer was where all the value was in mathematics. And what we've learned, what I've known and experienced as a math teacher, is sometimes kids can get the right answer and have no idea what it means and have no idea why it's important. They can just go through a procedure. In fact, as a math student myself, that was me. I was a good memorizer. I was good at recognizing patterns, so I got labeled good at math. It wasn't until I started teaching math that I really understood some of those foundational concepts. And that's what these new standards are trying to shift, and that's the information the new assessments will give us. So if you have a pencil and you want to jot down what these rounded values would be, what I really want to illustrate here is that you could probably complete this whole worksheet and get all of the answers right if you understand and know the rule for rounding. But the real mathematical idea that's behind this is place value. And an understanding of place value is absolutely crucial in doing the 4 operations with numbers at the elementary level. If a student doesn't understand how place value works, then it just becomes a series of steps that make no sense, and I can't reason through a problem. I can't tell whether a solution is a reasonable solution to the problem I just solved because I'm not making sense of the numbers. So a student could get every single one of these right and not really understand anything about place value. They've just memorized the rule for rounding. I look at the digit, and if it's 5 or bigger, I go up, and if it's less than 5, I don't. Presto, I get them all right. I have no idea what place value means. So what I'm passing around now is that exact same content, the same idea as place value. This is a sample PARCC-like item, and this is one that's been available to us as educators for several years. So we've known sort of what are these test items going to look like. So I like this because it even has the same context. Now it's baseball stadiums instead of a basketball, but the same idea. The Part A asks students to put these stadium seating values in order from least to greatest. So I have to be able to make sense of what those numbers mean and what do I need to compare. If this is a fairly low level skill, but then it goes on. And I'm going to take those same three stadium values and compare what two students said about rounding them. One student says, well, when I round, I get all the same number. And another student says, well, when I round, I get two the same, but one different. Both students have rounded correctly. How could that be possible? Well, here a student has to have a solid understanding of what rounding is about and how place value plays in. Just for those of you that need to know the answer, if you round to the thousandths place, then all of these round to 42,000. But if you round to the hundredths place, which is also perfectly reasonable for estimating the seating capacity of a baseball stadium, then two of them come out to 41,900 and one of them comes out to 42,400. So a student has to really understand the nuances of place value and why we round and how rounding to different values is different. And then my favorite question of all is thinking about that idea of rounding sort of from the backwards side. If I round and I get this value, what could the original value have been? What's the largest it could have been? What's the smallest it could have been? So if you compare that back to the first problem that I showed you, I have to have a much deeper understanding to be able to get Part B and Part C correct. And as a teacher, I know a whole lot better about what my students know and understand by looking at their responses to Part B and Part C. I got a handout for this too. So I talked a lot about the performance level descriptors and how proud I am to have been a part of writing these. This is the page of the 4th grade performance level descriptors that corresponds to the problems that you just looked at. So if you look, there's a lot of math speak here, which I'll talk you through. But the very first question was just about rounding using an algorithm. And that lives in level 3, which is below the target of level 4. If I have moderate command, I can round using the algorithm. But in order to get to the target level of level 4, I have to be applying a conceptual understanding of place value, which is exactly what you saw in the second set of questions. So I want you to see how those released items and the performance level descriptors work together to inform me as a teacher around what I need to teach and how I can support my students. I threw in some 7th and Algebra 1 examples to show that, but since we're short on time, I'll go through those quickly. I'm not an English language arts person, but I do know some things about the English language arts portion, and I want to just, as an example, in terms of the writing prompts, in the old world, many of our writing prompts were not text dependent. They asked students to rely on their own experiences, write about something that was familiar to them, but didn't necessarily cause them to rely on the text. And that's one of the big shifts. When we think about college readiness, I have 2 sons at the University of Colorado. They don't get to write about what does it feel like to be stressed at finals time. They have to write about the things that they're reading related to their academic progress, and they have to be able to pull from the text that they're reading to support and justify the things that they're writing about. So this is a much more usable skill for students than what we used to assess before. And then we have another handout that sort of elaborates more on the changes around English language arts, since that is not my content expertise. If you have additional questions there. Before we start questions, I just want to wrap it up by sharing with you what some of the teachers that I work with in my district are saying, and tell you a couple of stories. I want to address that bottom comment about Julie. Julie's a special education student in 7th grade, and one of the special education teachers that I'm working with this year has her students track their own growth on the interim assessments that she gives every month. And she creates a graph for them because they're actually practicing their graphing skills at the same time, and they can talk about slope when they graph how much they grew. Well, Julie was tracking how much she grew from the assessment in January to the assessment that she took a couple of weeks ago. And the graph didn't go high enough, and she called her teacher, Miss Clark, over and said, I can't get up to 40, the graph only goes to 38. Did I do something wrong? And her teacher was just delighted because Julie grew by 40 points. And when Miss Clark made the graph, she said, oh, I thought 38 would be the biggest anybody would ever, I thought that was way higher than I'd ever need. And this girl just blew her graph, her growth right off the charts, because now she's given the opportunity to not just have memorized procedures, which is really difficult, particularly for kids who struggle, but to rely on her common sense and her understanding of what's happening mathematically. Lots of my teachers have been working on shifting to the new standards and preparing kids for these new assessments. And although I know there are some loud voices out there saying, we don't want this and this is bad, I want you to know that there are lots of voices that I'm around every day that we do want it. We're excited. We've done the hard work to make these changes in our classrooms, and we really want the test results to know that we're doing the right things for our kids. And if we're missing the mark, we want to know that too, so we can make those adjustments. So it is time for questions. If anybody has any at this point, we would love to take them. We've got some on cards already.
I just have a question and a comment. First of all, it's so refreshing to hear an educator be excited about testing. Because, what I think I've been hearing down here, at least this session, is that there seems to be a high level of fatigue around testing, to the point that people are saying that we're over testing. And so I'm not quite sure, we talked about this a little bit last night. First, my question regarding the field testing, what happens when you have technology issues, when there's reliability? Because some of the testing, I understand this happened in the state, there has been some reliability with the technology shutting down, or something happens and the student may not be able to finish. I'm not quite sure what that's about, if you can speak to that. And then this whole piece regarding parents' engagement as it relates to testing. You had the voice of some of the teachers, and you had the voice of some students. But what are the parents saying about PARCC?
Do you want to do the shutdown question? Do you want me to do it?
Sure. Let's see. Oh, that's right. It doesn't move, and it's not actually projecting. Representative Field, when you ask a question, I feel like I'm in a committee room, so that I need to state my name. So on the field tests and technology. So the field tests that we've been doing for PARCC, so those tests don't count. So if we may learn that there was a technology issue, and we have to record that with PARCC and with the Pearson help desk. What we have found, though, is that when there are glitches going on, we're able to get them resolved relatively quickly, and the kids can continue and resume their testing. Only on one occasion did we have, and it was an internet outage for the whole area, that they needed to resume the next day. But we've been able to get through the testing. What we've discovered is that I think is encouraging is that most of the issues we're uncovering are very site-specific. It might be specific devices they're using or a way that they've connected it that we can troubleshoot on the phone with them through the help desk. We haven't seen system-wide problems. As Laura mentioned, there are some areas where people say it could be easier to log on, it could be easier to do this. All that data is getting gathered so that we can make those adjustments and improve that for the live administration next year.
I just want to add perspective too, because I think it's easy because everything is new and there's a lot of attention on the new system. I mean, definitely the fact that it's technology based is new, and there'll be some glitches related to that. But glitches in testing has been part of our world already. I mean, I gave a CSAP test where the pages got stapled upside down, so we have to deal with that. A student will get sick in the middle of a testing session and leave, and we have to deal with that. So that, that glitches and the things that come up and disrupt the system is not new. That's part of the education world, and we'll adjust to those things as we always have.
And
The parent, do you want to share from your perspective?
I can talk a little bit. Honestly, it depends on who you ask. There definitely are some parents who are feeling frustrated at the amount of testing that's happening. And one of the things I hear all the time is, well, instruction shuts down for 3 weeks before the test so we can do test prep. Or, my kid's getting tested every single week and every single week. And we need to sort of step back and say, is this an issue of poor instructional practice, or is this an issue of assessment? And when we think about the number of assessments that we are required to give in schools versus the number of assessments we actually give in schools, that's where we need to find the balance. And first, we have some control over that as educators. So I can choose as a teacher that I'm going to test my kids every single Friday, or I can say, that's going to cause fatigue for my students, and I'm not going to do it that regularly. I'm going to do different kinds of ways to gather that information. Personally, I'm not a test prep believer, because Jill talked about when you go to the doctor's office and get your blood, you don't prep for your blood test. I don't prep for my annual physical. I don't eat healthy for the 2 weeks before I go for my physical. It's about what I do all year. And that's the same thing in my classroom. If I am teaching to the standards, and the standards are well aligned to important student learning, and the assessments are well aligned to the standards I'm teaching, then what I do every day is test prep. And I don't need to shut down my classroom and shut down the learning to get kids ready for a single, engagement with something that is going to measure that. So, although yes, there are some parent voices that are frustrated, particularly when we think about special populations and the mandates around assessing them. I mentioned special ed before, and we're required to do progress monitoring. So how do we collect that data that supports those students in their learning without overburdening the system? And I think that's a juggle that we have to do as educators.
And I
One
think
thing I'd love
go
to
ahead.
add about the test prep thing is, remember we talked about how in English language arts literacy, all of the items and all of the questions are text dependent. They're not independent of the text. They're actually driven from the text. So it's very hard to prep, to do typical test prep for that. You actually can't do that. And so I think that's a really important fact of these tests. We're not comparing apples to apples. This is a different way of testing where it's mirroring good classroom practice. And so the things that you do every day in your classroom will then have payoff because your kids are learning, and the test will reflect what they're learning. They actually have to read the passages on the test and then think about those based on the kind of structure and rigor that they've been brought to reading texts in their classroom.
So Colorado is a very interesting state, as we all know, in many ways. We have a state board of education that is they are duly elected officials in their own right. So we don't, as a legislature, we don't control them, if that's the right word. They have recently taken a vote, and Jill, help me, you think we're just right across the street, so we would really know each other's business intimately, but we don't. They've recently taken a vote, and it was more Common Core, I believe, against Colorado being involved with the Common Core. How does that affect all of this and what we're doing? Is the State Department of Education just moving forward? The State Board of Education has clearly voted, I believe. Could you maybe speak to that?
Sure. I think it is a great question, and it can be confusing. So our state board met and did a panel discussion about PARCC, and it was about the PARCC assessments. And they had panelists who were for the PARCC assessments and panelists who were against the PARCC assessments, and kind of facilitated a public discussion about that. And then the board took on a 4-3 vote action to essentially a call to action to the legislature, asking them to repeal the legislation that required Colorado to join PARCC. So that was the action that was taken, essentially a request to the General Assembly to repeal that and restore the state board's authority to determine what kinds of assessments to engage in. So that was the action that was taken. The department is responsible for administering the law, and the law right now is that we are participants in PARCC. We're very active in PARCC, and Commissioner Hammond is on the executive committee of PARCC, which is weekly involved in the sort of the day-to-day functioning of the organization. So unless there is a statutory change, that is the department's role, is to administer the law. So that is what we are doing.
Okay, so I don't see that, and maybe Representative Fields knows more. I don't see that on our radar. I don't see that coming down the pike. And we both said in the Education Committee. So I guess my best guess is that's not going to happen this legislative session, which means that doesn't happen, there's no chance of happening until next January. I mean, how far down the road we will be with all of this to pull the plug, it will just be unconscionable at some point. I know you don't run the State Board of Education, but I'm just throwing that in as a real concern of mine here in Colorado, that our State Board of Education, our legislature at this point, I don't believe are on the same page.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add to that comment in terms of how far down the road we are. You know, we adopted the Common Core standards in 2010, and my district has been working since then to implement those in our classrooms. We are 3 years in to implementation of these standards. This is what we've been teaching our kids, and we've been living with the frustration of a state assessment that doesn't align to what we've been teaching as much as we'd like. And so to now get right to the very brink of, wow, it's almost here, and to have that pulled out from underneath us as educators would be really, really frustrating and really difficult.
So speaking of things being pulled out from underneath us, we are having this room taken away from us. So sorry, if you didn't get your questions answered, we have cards so you can write that with your contact info. And we can get back to you that way. So sorry guys, we've got antsy people out in the hallway.
Thank you, though.
Thank you all.
Thank you for the opportunity